Doug Davis with Crombie Realty, broker in charge with another edition of Ask Doug. And I actually got this question from a friend of mine who has a brand new house and was horrified to find out that the renters, proposed renters, or one of the groups had animals, and he didn't want to have animals in his house. So we're going to talk about that. And I have with us today Lindsay of my office, who's going to have a short talk about how we vet animals, well, really pets, because you can't do any, well, we're going to talk about all of that. She's going to talk about how we verify that a emotional support animal or service animal or deals with pets, and if it's real. We have to get to the bottom of that if we're going to put an animal in one of our rental properties. So
Right.
being a housing provider, we have to adhere to these various laws. So let me start just with, what are we talking about? These animals, what kind of animals are we talking about? Well, there's three classifications. One is pets. We all know what pets are, but there's two more now. There's support animals, and of that, there's two classifications. There's the service animals, and I believe most of us are familiar with seeing eye dogs, for example. And there's other animals that are trained, but some of those might be emotional support animals. So those would be, they look like a pet, but they do something for the human. So whether it be helpful things, train things, or just being some support for some disability. Okay, I'm going to go into the actual federal definitions of these as we go along. But it's just these three basic things. That's what we're going to talk about today. And this isn't easy. I started going through this and found all of these different caveats and questions you can ask, questions you can't ask. You'll be in violation of the federal guidelines, federal laws, and do something unlawful, and then you're exposed to being sued. So let me just go over a number of these different caveats that you should be aware of. So be careful on how you use the word pet. Pet is only for animals that are not a service animal or an emotional support animal. They're different, and use the proper vocabulary or you get in trouble. Security deposits are only for pets, not the other two. Can't have a security deposit for a service animal or an emotional support animal. It's like, wow. So you can ask for damages at the end of the tenancy, but no security deposit. Some tenants are using or trying to get their pet classified as an emotional support animal so they can circumvent having to pay a security deposit. So it's important to verify if the emotional support animal is indeed that. So that's a game out there. House rules. House rules would only apply to pets, not for the other two. And then I mentioned you have permissible questions and questions you cannot ask. So be aware of that. So it's gotten to the point where it's just too risky for landlords to just go out and rent now. So it might be a good idea to actually hire us for property management, where we have the services to vet the animals to make sure they are what they are, so you can make a informed decision on whether they would be allowed. And if you're a landlord and you don't want any animals, there's no solution other than you can't put it on the rental market, because you'd be subject to having an animal be in your home should someone apply with one of these animals. So I'm going to have Lindsay talk about our vetting process for not only do we check out credit scores for the humans, we check out their criminal records, we contact landlords, among other things, to make sure that we're getting the right human into your rental property. But this is what we do for the animals. So
Right.
Lindsay?
So, hi. Yeah, we've added another layer of screening, which is our pet screening. We've added that into our application process. So any applicant that comes through, whether they have an animal, service animal, emotional support animal, a pet, or even no pet, they will fill out this section accordingly. And then if they do have a pet, let's say emotional support animal or service animal, they'll provide all of the documentation that we would need. So vaccinations, microchips, the ESA papers or the service animal papers, and those all get submitted here in the pet screening.
Doctor notes,
all of those things. So what ends up happening is our pet screening program will then vet those documents, essentially vetting the animals. So we can find out if they are in fact what they say they are, and that is to help us, in that one more layer of making sure we're getting the right tenant in. And actually, to touch on what Doug was saying about getting papers for an emotional support animal to bypass the security deposit, they also do this to bypass building rules, because a lot of no pet buildings cannot say no to emotional support animals or service animals. So
how does the service, how do they get paid?
Oh, so the cool thing, it's actually kind of a neat program, because it benefits not only us as the property managers to make sure we have all the right documentation and so forth. It benefits the tenants because they do pay a fee for this service, but they can carry their profile with them to their next house or their next rental. For their next landlord, they can provide this, and then they can also provide this to their pet groomers, pet sitters, any kind of animal or pet service that they want to take their little furry pet to.
So the homeowner doesn't pay, the tenant pays.
Correct.
It's all on their dime to get their.
So this costs nothing to the homeowner, right?
Perfect.
Right, but it benefits the homeowner.
And how long have you seen this process take, short and long?
As far as the applicant?
Yes, to get the result back.
It's pretty quick. We did have, a couple take several days, but we can watch that and we get alerted by the pet screening program as soon as it's verified. And then we can go ahead and add that to their application and say yes or no. And this also helps, explain to the homeowner that, hey, we've done this screening process for the animal, because they might not be comfortable, but like Doug said, you can't exactly say no. So this is
the longest one you've seen was that
maybe
3 days?
3 days or so. Yeah. It doesn't take too long.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, and then they get a FIDO score. Did you say that already?
No.
Oh, they get a FIDO score. So the pet owner would enter, all the pet information, breed, age, weight, vaccination records, all of those things, ownership habits. And, let's say there's an incident, we would report that to the pet screening, and that kind of weighs their 1 to 5 paws, which is their FIDO score. So and that gets carried with
Which
them.
is similar to the human FICO score credit rating that we get
Right.
on prospective tenants.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So
Okay, well,
that's all
thank
I
you for
got.
that.
Okay, welcome.
I'm gonna have Lindsay step aside and then go into the rest of my info here. Okay, so why do we need to do this? It's because this is increasing. Yeah. Industry stats now, 60% of residents have pets and animals. That's a lot. And of that, 91% have a household pet, 9% have a legitimate assistance animal. That's 1.3 average pets per household. And the reasonable accommodation requests are up 61% year to year. So this is, it's increasing. So the likelihood of a landlord getting an animal request has increased. Now, realize that these animals are a protected class, just like race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, national origin, and now we have animals. So, okay, so just real quickly, permissible question. I just wanted to go over that. And again, we'll do a little bit more detail further on. But if you have a tenant ask you, for example, that they have a emotional support animal, you may ask if they have a disability. You cannot ask what their disability is. And you may ask, what service does the animal provide for your disability? You can ask that. So it's pretty limited. Okay, so let me just define the animals in a little bit more detail once again. So we know what pets are, that's one. And then number two is a subset of service animals. So assistance animal. You have a service animal like a seeing eye dog or support animals. All right, so pet, service, and support. Pet, service, and support. All right, this is all through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, through the Fair Housing Act. And it's called reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act. The notice, this notice that I'm going to be going over, is the obligation of the housing provider, so that's landlords or property managers, with respect to animals that individuals with disabilities may request as a reasonable accommodation. And that be service or other, which is trained or untrained animals that do work, perform tasks, provide assistance, or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities. Okay. And then as a property manager or housing provider, landlord, you need to do two things. You need to assess the person's request, and then you need to have the documentation. So that's where we're going with this. So the Fair Housing Act makes it unlawful for housing providers to refuse to make reasonable accommodation that a person with a disability may need in order to have equal opportunity to enjoy the use of a dwelling. And that includes public and common areas. So if you're in a condo with one of these animals, You can go into the common areas, public, and I suppose the swimming pool areas, and that sort of thing. Assistant animals, can't say this enough, they're not pets. Assistant animals are not pets. So here's a caveat, another one, I should have said this earlier, but FHA complaints concerning denial of reasonable accommodations comprises 60% of their caseload, complaint load, caseload. That's huge. So you need to make sure that you're doing it exactly correct. And there are cascade questions that I will go over on how to make this determination. Here's another caveat. A person, you have a husband and wife, they both could have the need for an emotional support animal or a service animal. So you could have 2 dogs, for example, in your rental. So the service animal under the ADA definition means any dog, one animal, a dog, that is individually trained to do work, perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability, including physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disability. Other species of animal, whether wild or domestic, trained or untrained, are not service animals for the purpose of this definition. So that's a service animal. I don't know what happens with the small horse. That doesn't seem to be around anymore. So, okay, question cascade for service animal. Is the animal, number one, is the animal a dog? So that's the first question that you can ask. And number two, is it readily apparent that the dog is trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability? So if it's yes, it could be very obvious it's yes. If no, then you keep going. So is it readily apparent when the dog is observed to be guiding the individual who's blind or has low vision, pulling a wheelchair, providing assistance with stability or balance? So those are some of the things that you could observe. Is the animal required because of a disability? What work or task has the animal been trained for? But do not ask about what kind of disability. So it's either yes or no. If no, then they don't qualify. If it's yes, then the animal gets to stay with them, and it's a service animal. Okay, number two is just a definition of reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, or practice or a service that may be necessary for a person with a disability to have equal opportunity to enjoy a dwelling. So get this, a resident may request a reasonable accommodation either before or after acquiring the assistant animal. So you could have a tenant that you move in and they want to get an emotional support animal after they've been in for a couple of months, perhaps. And there isn't anything that you can do about it if it's a true need and there's a disability and they supply documentation. So, so even if you don't have an animal when you start, you could have an animal by the time they leave. Okay, so accommodation animal is next. Does the person have an observable disability? So there's all kinds of impairments, blindness, deafness, hearing, mobility limitations, intellectual impairments, autism, Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, brain injury, mental illness. These might be observable, but housing providers are not entitled to know the individual's diagnosis. The person requesting the accommodation needs to provide documentation that reasonably supports the person seeking with a disability. They need to have like a doctor's note. It's starting to end up that the doctor letter is perhaps the most important document that they can provide. But there could be other things, could be a disability from, maybe they were in the Army or armed service and they have some sort of disability. They can have receipt of disability benefits from Social Security. That would be proof of. They could have a housing voucher from HUD for eligibility for housing assistance. That would be proof. And information confirming disability from a healthcare professional. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a doctor, but it could be an optometrist, psychiatrist, psychologist, physician's assistants, a nurse practitioner, or a nurse. They can all do the letter giving proof of disability. And that's why we have the PET screening vetting process, so they can confirm with these people that this is indeed something that they wrote and they know this person, it's true. There are websites that sell certificates, registrations, and licensing documents for assistant animals, but a lot of them may be bogus. And HUD knows this, and we know this. So that's part of the vetting process, is to see if it's from one of these websites, and that's evaluated. So in HUD's experience, is what they say, such documentation from the internet is not by itself sufficient to reliably establish an individual that has a non-observable disability or disability-related need for an assistance animal. So that's not going to cut it anymore. So the doctor letter is going to be the most important piece of document, but not necessarily the only one. The person requesting the accommodation is responsible for providing the best information, documentation for the housing provider. It is up to them. So they have to have reasonably supporting information. There has to be a relationship or connection between the disability and the need for an assistance animal, and that has to be provided. And the housing provider may ask for information that's consistent with what I've been talking about here, is other types of information given by the tenant to support their need. So, and then there's also a question about what type of animal. So service animal now is only a dog. The emotional support can be a dog, but it can be a cat, it can be a small bird, a rabbit, hamster, gerbil, other kind of rodent, fish, turtle, other small domesticated animal that's traditionally kept in the home for pleasure rather than for commercial purposes, then that would be a reasonable accommodation animal. It could be a unique animal, and they list a good example, and that's with a capuchin monkey that performs a task for a person that is paralyzed by a spinal cord injury. The monkey's been trained to retrieve a bottle of water from the refrigerator, unscrew the cap, insert a straw, and place the bottle in a holder so the individual can get a drink of water. The monkey's also trained to switch lights on and off, retrieve requested items from inside a cabinet, and so forth. So that would be an animal that's unique. Housing, just the last couple of things here. So housing provider may not charge a fee for processing a reasonable accommodation request. You can have an outside service like we do, pet screening. And then get this, housing providers may not limit the size or breed of a dog used as a service animal or a support animal just because of those two facts, size or breed. Oh boy. Housing provider may not charge a deposit or fee or surcharge, can't charge anything. You can only charge for a pet. 3 types of animals, can only do the deposit for a pet. And then I'd like to say something about the pet too. If you have a security deposit in Hawaii, you are allowed to charge as much as the security deposit as the humans are. So if you're charging $3,000 a month, you can charge $3,000 as security deposit for the pet. Okay, and you know, even that might not be sufficient. So say it's a small dog pet and it makes a mess of the carpet and it doesn't come out with steam cleaning, then the landlord needs to replace the carpet, and it's probably going to cost more than $3,000 to replace the carpet. So the landlord isn't fully covered necessarily with the security deposit, even for pets. So, and then maybe you don't charge, maybe there's a, you know, $3,000, that's $3,000 for the human and $3,000 for the pet. That's $6,000 plus the first month's rent. You got $9,000. A tenant may have difficulty coming up with that much money. So then you do maybe $500 for the pet. Then you're really out, perhaps, with the tenant. So nothing's perfect here. So there you go. 3 different types of animals for housing. So you really need to know what you're doing when someone has a service animal or emotional support animal, and you can't say no. You have to go through the vetting process and determine this properly. So there you go. I hope this helps. That was an awful lot for 3 animals, 3 types of animals. It's amazing, but it's now a federal thing, and watch your butt on that. Okay, love your questions and keep them coming, and see you next week.